round 4 of IIUM Open with the motion feminist activists in Iran have an obligation to participate in protests against the hijab. Prime Minister. Here. Paneling with me is Najib and is my trainee as well.
Hijab used to be a symbol of hope for a lot of women on the ground, especially women in Iran. But there was a point where there was a dictatorship of what women wore. And it came to a point where there was a lot of religious policing, and it made women feel extremely uncomfortable, in fact violated at that point in time where there was an extreme dictatorship of what they wore. We think that it's time that a lot of these women take an active stance against this form of oppression, and they have an obligation in order to push for that movement and to push for the liberation of women in Iran. What am I going to be doing in my speech? Firstly, I'll be contextualizing to you what does support really mean in status quo, and how do we improve the support by galvanizing a lot of individuals to push forward for that movement actively on the ground. Two of my arguments is what is the moral obligation that's necessary for these women to empower women in Iran, but secondly, why is it that we're likely to get change in the world of opening government, why this is the most important. So what does support really look like on the ground right now? There always is an incentive to coordinate protests, but it's always extremely dysfunctional and disorganized within status quo. The fact that these protests are usually extremely minimal, they only take pictures, some women who are of privileged positions take pictures, while other women on the ground cannot help them in the long run. The second thing is that there's always a lack of funding when it comes to wanting to organize these protests. Oftentimes these women are also not taken seriously at that point in time, or there will be policemen watching and monitoring what happens towards these women. But the third thing is that there is no representative of who is the leader of that movement, of that protest. There is never a figurehead in order to continuously push for that movement. Therefore, it's more likely to die out in Iran, right? But we think that during the period of elections, or during periods where there is a lot of political say, we think that that is a time when women should step up, or like in any period of time where they're available, they should step up. Why do we think this is the best way for you to push for your movement? The first is because a lot of the times the media in Iran clamps down on the coverage of what happens towards women in Iran. Only some of it gets showcased on Twitter and Instagram, but a vast majority of them lose out within status quo. And therefore there is never enough galvanizing support for women on the ground, and we think that that is the reason why we should push for a moral obligation for these very women to be the leader heads, to actively lobby for them within status quo, right? First argument, why is there an existing moral obligation that is necessary to push for the empowerment of women in Iran? The first is because there is a lot of grassroots supports currently within the feminist movement, but a lot of individuals are oftentimes scared to push for it. So we will preempt things like backlash, or the safety or denial of individuals within job, or the fact that they might be persecuted if at that point in time they were to rally against them, right? But we think that those things are already existing within status quo. There are custodian policies that hinder women from pushing forward for that movement, but we think that that is literally the metric for how social justice movements operate. If not, we wouldn't have pushed for things like slavery, we wouldn't have pushed for the feminist movement or the LGBTQ movement at that point in time in other developing nations if it were not for the backlash that exists within status quo. No thank you. The comparative in ops world is to prove how, when there is an existing of no obligation, how they empower the feminist movement in Iran. If they think that these women do not deserve to fight the good fight, I think that it's shameful coming from opening opposition, right? But the first obligation, no thank you, is that because the feminist movement in Iran especially requires a lot of support, because the hijab was a different context altogether back in the day, right? Like before this hijab, Iran was considered a relatively secular state. And now that they're moving towards becoming more religious, that exists a form of oppression towards these women. No thank you. The fact that these women also are now given the choice to liberate is something that a lot of other women should champion within status quo as well. Because an idea of stealthy freedom to break the structural mode of oppressions is imperative in pushing forward for a better movement within status quo. Why do we think that at the point in time where you continuously allow for these women to not have an obligation, you actually make them complicit within the atrocities. Because it is not likely that these people would be in a situation where they would scale down their operations. I think that oftentimes they would be continuously more dictatorial towards these women, and it makes it even harder for them to push forward for a lot of movements. It's a unique position for women to be in right now, considering that there is significant amount of media traction, or at least enough for you to push forward for your movement. If they decide that they don't want to do this, that means that they're remaining neutral, right? Like in the same way that in wars where like certain countries did not want to fight or did not want to fight against oppression and ethnic cleansing, it's the same principle here, because your neutrality comes at the expense of other people, and we will prove complicity in the next argument. But a lot of individuals who do this are obviously trying to like aim it towards Iranian women, and you will never be able to help them in status quo in a world where there is no reason to push for political change, not yet. The reason why this would happen in our world is because the obligation, whether you struggle or whether you're not, is literally in the autonomy of that woman's hand. Complicity isn't based on intent, but based on the outcome of it. Or for regardless of the intent of the oppression that continues, even if you're unable to get meaningful change, you at least get a voice by the traction that you push forward when there is a galvanizing support that exists within status quo. I'll take you at 6. But Iran, when it was initially secular, there was an increasing ability for it to also make a lot of concessions. And this is a nuance that comes from opening government on why we are likely to get change within status quo. Because the Iranian government is too known to have made concessions in the past, during the 2009 revolution, where there were demands for Iranian to liberate the economy or to not fund terrorists, when there is a bunch of galvanizing support for individuals on the ground, the viscerality that happened, the outspokenness of the people, that is when there was a promotion of discussion, and that was when there was an ability for you to make change. I think that it's more important that you get that change right now. Before I move on, yes, Yarn.
So given everything you've said,
okay,
do you think there's kind of like a general obligation for all feminists, or at least all Muslim feminists in the world, to agitate against hijab?
Yeah, sure, whatever. Whatever is right for them. So in the context of Iran, because people are being suppressed, then we're perfectly fine with them taking it off. In other countries, if they feel hope, then that's fine, right? Like, we think that it's really important, especially in the context of Iran, considering that all other women are never given that autonomy and option. We think that that POI comes from a position of privilege. But we think that politicians and lobbying is exceptionally important in pushing forward for a better movement, because right now, especially when you can concede that there is a trend analysis that Iran is currently making a lot of political concessions, especially when there are people who are willing to overthrow their government, that means they're more likely to listen to you, right? That means that the discussion and the viscerality of what happens, especially considering that the feminist movement is not just enclosed to Iran, but also other women in society. That also means that there is more of a position for other women to help you in the long run. When you do not have an obligation, or when there is an inability for you to speak up within the people who exist within your country, that means that you are complicit within all the crimes and oppression that happen towards women. We do not want that to happen. We think that women should have the autonomy to choose, but right now that choice is a Hobson's choice, and you should not agree in the world of opposition.
Alright, thank you, Prime Minister. Hello.
So yeah, I saw your phone.
Yeah.
They are right that we ought to be for the freedom of women to choose what they wear or what they put on their heads. And that is why we think that feminists, Muslim feminists or Iranian Muslim feminists do not have an obligation to protest against the hijab. Note that the wording of the motion, though this is, I guess, a cheap trick in debating parlance, says that this is about protest against the hijab, not about protest against the specific mandatory laws of wearing the hijab in Iran. So I would say that government bench has an obligation to defend protests about all Muslim women not wearing the hijab as an oppressive act, which is a burden the government bench has yet to meet. In fact, it's quite unclear where the oppression comes from, because I hear literally no analysis or elaboration from the Prime Minister about why the hijab is oppressive, only that it exists as a law that is mandated in the Islamic Republic of Iran. I would add that even if you say that this law is oppressive because it mandates a certain thing, in Iran at least, which is a theocracy, religious obligation and law are inseparable, because that's the way theocracies work. They turn religious obligations into laws, which is to say, even in the most charitable sense, what opening government has to defend is a militation against the fact that Islam has wearing the hijab as a commandment or obligation that people can choose to fulfill, to whatever extent they want. Anything about why that feminists in Iran specifically should militate against the law because it is a law and has the full force of the state behind it is actually just an argument against Iran as a theocracy, which we might, accept that it would be better if Iran were not a theocracy, but that's not the debate. The debate is about whether the religious obligation to wear a hijab is something that Muslim feminists should fight against, and these guys, to an extent, accept that burden when they answer my POI saying, yes, we think Muslim feminists in general ought to protest against the hijab. Note also, and finally, just to close this issue, even if you claim it is merely a protest against the law, it is likely to be viewed, and it is certainly the way in which this protest is made in the rest of the world, that it is a protest against the wearing of the hijab itself and the obligation that exists in Islam for Islamic women to wear the hijab. So this is about that. The second thing I want to talk about is what the nature of obligations is. And this is important because thinking about what an obligation means changes the way you should judge this debate from the normal way you should judge debates. Normally, when we have this house should do something motion, the standard of proof in which you judge the debate is whether on balance that thing is correct. That is not true for the case of obligations, which compel people to act in a certain way, which means that you can't just tell me that 51% of the time it is more likely to be true, but that in a massive preponderance of the time this is definitely true, that crucially there exists no reasonable alternative to this action. That's important because again, this is entirely absent from the opening government's material thus far. We hear reasons why perhaps you should oppose the hijab, and I think these are in fact reasonable things to say, but note I don't actually have to rebut any of these things, because I can accept that reasonable reasons exist for some Muslim women to say that I don't want to wear the hijab or that Muslim women shouldn't wear the hijab, but the burden on their side of the house to prove that these reasons are the only reasons that can exist, that there exists no possible reasons for a Muslim woman to think that it's possible to be Muslim, feminist and hijabi at the same time. So that's going to be the next part of my speech where I talk about some of these reasons. And then finally in my speech, second part of constructive, I'm going to talk about why this might lead to bad outcomes and therefore you should not be obliged to participate in action that leads to bad outcomes. So the first substantive portion of my speech is about why it's unclear if wearing the hijab is an anti-feminist act. Firstly, feminists generally believe that you have the freedom to do as you please, and note that the discussion about whether Muslim women should be allowed to wear the hijab or indeed have to be compelled to take off their headscarf in public contexts or in all contexts at all is often framed in Western contexts as a way of freeing these women from some imagined oppression that exists from within their Islamic heritage and so on and so forth. But this is in fact anti-feminist, or at least it is reasonable for feminists to think that the act of choosing to wear the hijab is a personal choice. But note, secondly, even as there are arguments which government has made and will continue to make that wearing a hijab is a religious imposition, note that the framework of imposition is quite unclear in this instance. It is true on balance that you are coerced in some degree by the circumstances that surround you to want to make this decision and to choose to think that wearing a hijab is good for you in a religious sense, and it is true that some women are in fact forced into wearing a hijab. But that is not true of all women. Some women are able to construct within that religious context a notion of how it is both plausible for them to be Muslim and wear the hijab, for them to think that wearing the hijab makes them closer to God, for them to reconstruct the obligations that are placed upon them for the Quran into something that they find personally acceptable and that they opt into as part of the set of general guidelines and obligations that all religions prescribe upon us. So if you think about it, panel, religion is about the process of giving up your autonomy into the guidelines and commandments of a religion that you think lead you to a greater happiness. That is exactly the process in which Muslim feminists, who also are hijabis, reconcile their religious constraints and decisions with the doctrine of personal choice. Before I go on.
The fight against hijab
the oppression of hijab is entrenched within the law of the Iranian people. It's much more like slavery out that the law is also entrenched within the law of the United States. The fight against slavery is literally the same fight against the slave law. The same thing is applicable to the hijab.
No, it's quite different. Because, as I said at the beginning of my speech, this is about whether wearing the hijab is an acceptable religious obligation, and as I've been saying on this point, it is an acceptable religious obligation because people opt into it in the same way as they would opt into other religious obligations. Note also, and finally, that even if they want to say that the hijab is an important symbol of oppression because it is visible and so on and so forth, know that it is part of a bundle of other impositions, and it is indeed these other impositions that we feel are more important and you ought to fight against more. So if they say, for example, that the laws of Iran are oppressive against women writ large, it is not the law that forces them to wear the hijab that is the most oppressive. It is in fact other laws such as your inability to access education or to be seen in public without a male guardian that are far more oppressive. Protesting against the hijab does not protest the other impositions and protests the least significant of all of them. That leads me, even though I don't have much time it takes to expand upon this, on why this may be instrumentally bad. Firstly, a protest against hijab is highly visible and makes you very identifiable. You may face personal or state reprisal in a way that we think individuals ought not have to put themselves in harm's way in order to fight for an uncertain claim. Note that it is entirely unclear what the outcomes are. On their side, it is plausible that we may succeed, but it is equally plausible that you may not. It should be up to each individual's determination to deem whether they want to put themselves at personal risk or not. That is why it is not obligatory. Finally, two things. Note that participating in this process does two things. Firstly, it makes it seem as if Islam and feminism are incompatible because now feminists are being seen very publicly to be protesting an important symbol and pillar of Islam. That's probably bad in terms of the uptake of feminism within Islamic countries. But secondly, it binds feminism in Islamic areas like Iran to Western concepts of what feminism should be, like how the hijab is oppressive for all Muslim women. We think that's also bad. Takes to expand further on that. We're very, very proud to oppose.
Thank you all for that speech. DPM.
The reason Iran and Turkey are different is because in Turkey, there are laws that wants you to wear hijab, but they're not mandatory. In Iran, it's mandatory. So by the very definition of that, it means that very piece of cloth and the law are just inseparable. They're one of the same thing that you have to fight against, even if this comes at the expense of you going against some religious principle. And I'm going to tell you how those religious principles can be traded off, even within the framework of Islam, how it's often traded off. Because even in Islam, everything you practice has to be out of your free will. That's why we have a verse in the Quran that says there's no compulsion in religion, and it's very enforcement. What the Iranian did essentially is enforce people to oblige into a certain part of religion. It essentially go against the due process that's entrenched within the framework of Islam. I think they have to deal with it properly. But secondly, I think it's literally like beating around the bush for you to separate the hijab and the law that establishes hijab. They're one of the same thing, and you have to fight against them. That's number one. But number two, understand that if the feminist movement decide to fight against the hijab, it means there are going to be women who are not bounded by the words of the feminist movement or by the feminist movement is not a government. That is to say, if the feminist movement fight against the hijab, there are women who are not bounded by the authorities of the feminist movement who can choose to wear the hijab. But the feminist movement, or women who are bounded by the authorities who decide to join the feminist movement who do not want to wear the hijab, are more likely going to comply with those kind of things. So a choice is better created on our own word as opposed to a word in which you fold your arms and you allow the Iranian regime to actually further oppress these women. I do not think the kind of framing it provides really engages with the crux of those arguments. But secondly, they want to talk, and also like it's the same thing I raised in my PO, like it's tantamount like fighting slavery and the slavery law. It's pretty much the same thing. But secondly, let's talk about the obligation we talk about here. Look, the meaning of this obligation is this. You, like in status quo, the feminist movement have one of two choices. You either support them or at best you do not do anything. If you support them, it means you go all out to support this movement. If you do not do anything, it means you become complicit in the crimes that are being committed against these women. That's it. It doesn't get better than that. And also understand that the feminist movement, regardless of what religion you protect, you belong to, maybe probably you're a Buddhist in Iran or you're a Muslim, they have an obligation to protect you as a woman and remove every symbol of oppression. Understand that the reason this movement, my Stealthy Freedom, is very popular in Iran is because a lot of women actually feel the need to remove this hijab because they feel like it's oppression. It's a very popular movement in Iran because a lot of people are actually doing it, so they can't really say there's gonna be a lot of backlash. You can't literally put all Iranian women in prison. But the alternative on their side at best is like these individuals don't do anything and you become complicit in the crimes that are being committed against this individual. But thirdly, they want to talk about how it makes Islam and feminism not compatible. I think, look, what essentially happened on their side is a situation in which that incompatibility is furthermore entrenched the moment in which the feminist movement decide to fold their arms because you stay on different sides of the spectrum and you refuse to get into any kind of engagement. On our side, you're still gonna have like moderate Iranian leaders. Like Hassan Rouhani is a moderate, is a progressive, a person who is very different from Hashim Ahmadinejad, who is more of an asshole anyways. So what essentially happened is you're more likely going to have a more meaningful discussion with these moderate Islamic leaders who are less extreme, and you're more likely to have this leader who actually will speak out on your behalf like, okay, these things are compatible within the framework of Islam. Like Islam says you do not have to force this individual to actually wear hijab. I think all of the reasons they brought to us today are things that would literally not stand in this debate. What did they not respond to in Humai's speech? Humai gave you two things. He said, look, in principle obligation first, right? She said, look, this oppression is an oppression that comes on a personal level for these women because you essentially dictate what kind of clothes they can wear. This is more brutal than even giving them a custodian or placing them on their guardianship, right? Because it's literally telling them like this is what you can do with your body or this is what you can put on your body. This is extremely bad. What you essentially do as the feminist movement in Iran is you have an obligation toward these people to at the very least ensure that even if they do it by choice. But if you think going more extreme will be the only thing that gets you there, we think we are willing to go as extreme as go against the hijab totally. And also understand that I already explained to you why all women in Iran are not bounded by the feminist movement. It's only some women who decide to subscribe, which is actually a huge majority. But let's talk about complicity, because understand that the moment in which you fold your arms, you do nothing to stop this oppression. You go against the very thesis of your movement as a feminist movement. I think that's extremely bad for majority of this for the feminist movement, because you derive your support from the very same women you refuse to want to protect, but also the fact that you become less relevant the moment in which even if this thing becomes successful. But secondly, let's talk about movements and why they have to be physical. Understand that this is extremely important. This movement, my Stealthy Freedom, is something that's largely on social media. The Iranian leaders and the Iranian government has extreme power to crack down on social media, which is what they actually do, shut down social media. It means the long-term sustainability of this movement is very short. Like it's very short. Like you can't get, it doesn't translate in any kind of long-term change for two reasons. First, it's relatively easier for the Iranian government to shut down social media. But secondly, it's also a situation in which it's a splintered, disorganized group that's not taken very seriously. It's just a random post that's under probably an hashtag that has no leadership or no one to actually be the figure of this protest. What you essentially do when the feminist movement give their support is you have physical infrastructure that the feminist movement can actually use, like meeting in places, organizing riots and organizing protests. And understand how perverse how the Iranian before that here.
Right, so the distilled version of your case is just that the religious laws of the Islamic Republic are all illegitimate and the Iranian state is illegitimate. Even if that is true, which probably it is, why is it illegitimate for someone to decide that their personal safety is worth the trade-off and the efficacy of their protest?
So every social movement, every protest in word would always trade off your personal safety for the kind of things you actually want. Look at every movement. So personal safety is never a metric for us to deny a movement at all. They have to prove us why that's otherwise. But also, the second thing here is a situation in which it's more likely that these protests are shut down. It also means you have to make them physical. What we get on our side is a situation in which you have like the 2009 movement where the Iranians are willing to make concession when people actually decide to protest on the street, or earlier earlier this year when the Iranian government are willing to make concession with the economy when people protest. The moment in which there's a protest, the Iranian government are scared of instability and they're more likely to make concession into the needs and the wants, or like the kind of demands you are actually going to make. This is extremely important because the only way we can actually get any kind of meaningful change is for us to go physical with this protest, and the only way we get it is on side opening government where we actually force the Iranian regime to give some change.
We ready? Yeah. Cool. The opening government's burden in this motion is not simply to say two things, which they did say quite well. Number one, that there is a problem which can be solved, fine. And number two, that the masses would potentially speed up social change. Again, that's uncontested. The question in this debate that OG needs to answer is whether this issue is the biggest moral priority that generates this obligation as opposed to any of the number of things that feminists in Iran could be doing. And second of all, whether the actions that opening government demand of them have reasonable or unreasonable costs, such that even if the masses could help, it is potentially unfair to force those masses to be there in the first place. So here's how we're going to break down the debate. The first thing I want to ask is, let's grant lots of the assumptions of the opening government. This is the most important issue and that Iranian women have an interest in fighting for this. What sacrifices can we reasonably demand of individuals as obligations? Second question, would this advance the feminist movement writ large in Iran? And third of all, is it even coercive or non-feminist to wear the hijab and to vote for that or to activate yourself politically for that in Iran? Our claim is that there can never be an obligation incurred on you when the costs you have to bear are equal or greater to the benefits of your action. For example, you might be able to save someone's life if you know how to swim, and if you can't swim well, then you should have an obligation to save that person. But you do not have an obligation, most people would say, to run into a burning building to save a life, even if it is only your life at stake. It's equal moral harms, but you do not have that obligation because that life is yours, right? And we respect individuals not as utilitarian agents, but as individuals with choices, as opening government themselves think that this is an ideal society. The test case for this gov bench, and CG needs to answer this, by the way, is even if the masses could have gotten, say, gay marriage reform or LGBT reform faster, would it have been fair on their side of the house to say every LGBT individual is obliged to come out and identify fully as LGBT to their family or even in the most oppressive societies where the backlash then would have been greatest? Because let's grant the OG assumption that the masses would have fixed things. Fine, the best way, by their logic, is they can't throw every gay person in jail, but I just don't think that is a risk you can foist reasonably onto people and expect that they should be able to bear that, even if it won't have gotten us gay marriage 5 years or gay adoption 5 to 10 years faster. What are those costs? And the things that Jan talked about, right? Which I'm sure it was brief, but it was unresponded to. The fact that you are a visible protester, the fact that, like as they themselves say, the law in Iran that entrenches this is entrenched in an Islamic framework, which means that Islamic reactionary agents have a huge incentive to preserve the theocracy, no thank you, by clamping down publicly on these individuals. It's about costs like being arrested and losing your job, okay, maybe not a job, like losing educational opportunities, for example, if you're a young Iranian woman trying to get into university, about being discredited if you're a feminist and you try and protest for other things in the future, or even if you were none of these things, just the fact that you are now a social pariah or perceived as unclean in your religious community in a society which is overtly based on those religious tenets can be devastating, no thank you, for the rest of your life. These are costs which I wager are far greater than the gov benefit of gaining non-complicitness. Fine, complicity is a moral harm, but it is not the largest moral harm out there. And we do not expect individuals to bear moral harms. Like, if there is something way bigger that they themselves have to trade off. At best, if they are equal, we grant individuals the right to trade this off for themselves. We sure as hell don't conclude that there's an obligation to do so. No, thank you. Last few things to say here. Opening governments say lots of things about why the movement is not succeeding right now. I want to note that those are very same reasons as to why we should not place obligations on individuals. For example, when they say the media clamps down on what happens and there is no leader of a protest, this suggests that this movement is likely to fail because there is no leader and because the classic media will shut these things down. No, thank you. Which is, again, another reason why the obligation cannot exist if it's not likely to succeed or gain traction in the first place. Okay, second question. Let's dive into some of the assumptions of opening government. Because I don't want to get away with some of the sort of like, this is the most important issue or that this will work. I don't think it does. Why? I don't think this advances the feminist movement, and this is the second question. The main reason being, it allows the feminist movement or feminists writ large in Iran to be portrayed as pro-Western or anti-Islam. Why is this important? Because they have other feminist goals that matter as well. And that crucially, you would be similarly complicit in action if you say, perpetrated a state of affairs in which Iranian women found it harder to make decisions about their bodies, for example, or if it was harder for them to attend university. So by making a trade-off, either way you are complicit on some level. The point here is we should achieve the goals, whereby achieving those goals does not force you to be visibly pro-Western, as the info slide suggests, because it is a traditionally white feminist issue to say, oh, like what you wear is the most important thing. Most of the world's feminist movements are fighting for socio-economic rights at this point in time. But more importantly, it's also perceived as anti-Islam, because as they themselves point out, and thank you, the reason for this law is an Islamic justification, but there is no Islamic justification for why women or more women cannot go to school or attend university, and that's why those goals are preferable in the way we fight for them. They said 3 things as to why this would advance the feminist movement. Number 1, there is more voice and traction, it is better than none. I mean, true, but if a lot part of that voice gets locked up and deterred, it's not clear where that goes, but also just, as they themselves point out in their 3rd example, right, if there are moderate leaders to be appealed to, then you don't actually need the masses, right? The way you appeal to a moderate religious group, no thank you, is to give good arguments for why an interpretation of religion does not need to conclude in this policy or this law. You don't need masses for that. All you need is a number of feminists who willingly make the choice, like they do in the status quo, to do that, right? So, okay, I'm just very confused. I'm just not sure why the masses make a difference in Iran when the masses just aren't able to get rid of a theocratic government, for example, or able to significantly change foreign policy by virtue of the fact that it's not a fully fair and free democracy. I'll take one from closing if you've got one.
So what is your
Closing,
alternative?
yeah, sorry.
How do you retain any change that you might want?
As you might have guessed, we don't think change when it comes to the issue of wearing the hijab is the most important thing, i.e. we don't detract from other movements that are happening in Iran right now to go back to those secular days of education and women's choices in other areas that do not oppose religious groups. We think that's very important. But more importantly, moral obligations do not arise or are not designed with social change in mind. There is no moral God who says you have obligations and you don't because I'm trying to maximize social change in the world. That's not how moral obligations work. So if that's your case, it's wrong for that meta level. Finally, bit of extension here. It is now harder for women to identify as a feminist. Maybe closing is going to say this, not anymore. The reason for this is because they can't meet the obligation of being in this group or identify as a feminist, and lots of them will probably just choose not to identify as such, right? That is to say, they will actively disassociate themselves from this label. The reason this will happen is because on your side of the house, when you paint this as an obligation, other feminists in Iran will look at you and say, you call yourself a feminist, but you're not protesting with us on the streets. That makes you a bad feminist. And in many ways, that just makes you bite both harms, right? Because in a conservative society, you have to bite the harm of not being a true part of the liberal in-group, but you also have to bite the harm of being a pariah from your society as a whole. So, on that side of the house, there are fewer women to march for the things that unite all women, i.e. we also win on those metrics. Last of all, is wearing the hijab non-feminist or coercive? I think, look, they say some stuff here about why the law is the bad thing and so on and so forth. They miss the nuance of Jan's case. The claim we make is this. In a theocracy, the religious view about what is compulsory is also the civic view. The religious view of what being closer to God is in a theocracy is akin to voting for compulsory school programs or vaccinations. And that is why women who share or hold a view should not be made to vote for or protest for views that they do not hold. For all these reasons, oppose.
For the speech. Here.
It is true that there's some utility that can be derived from the hijab. It is also true that some women do seek empowerment in it. But there's a few things to take into consideration that within the recent years, hijab has been weaponized by most societies as a tool to systemically silence and oppress most women. Note that most forms of oppression do stem from this particular thing. I'll do 2 things in my extension. Firstly, I'll tell you why on principle Iranian feminists and just Muslim feminists in general should combat the hijab, be it just hijab in general or the hijab laws. Secondly, I'm going to tell you why an uncompromising blanket stance against the hijab is the best way to garner any form of change. In my first extension, I'll do a few things. I'll respond to this argument of why this should be priority number 1. Secondly, I'll tell you why you must activists should risk their life in this particular instance for this particular cause, right? So the first extension, and why in principle Iranian feminists should do this. What do they tell you with regards to this? They're like, look guys, it's bad because it sort of narrows the definition of what it means to be a feminist, and it sort of follows Western guidelines and standards for what it means to be a feminist, right? Like, I don't think that's necessarily true. I think the core definition of feminism is liberation of women through political and economic equality, right? That literally means that the point in time in which hijab contradicts these two things, it contradicts good old-fashioned women's rights. So this no longer just becomes a Western issue, this literally becomes a feminism issue, or an issue that feminists of all class society, like of all different classes and societies do have to opt into, right? This is where we believe that this falls into a broader definition of feminism as opposed to just a Western one. It isn't just the Western community that fights for basic forms of liberation for women, it is all forms of feminist groups out there, right? So we believe that this does succumb, or sorry, this does fall into various different definitions of feminism, right? But secondly, note that also, like, just generally speaking, right, what does the hijab represent to a lot of women in this instance, right? Within the particular years, the definition has overall changed, right? And we're going to tell you a few things. They said that this shouldn't be priority number one. Priority number one should be all sorts of different things, right? So long as I can prove to you that most oppression tends to stem from laws similar to this, I think it's fair to say we have won this issue, right? And I'm going to do this by a few ways. Firstly, what does the hijab necessarily symbolize in this instance, right? So, like, OG had done a good job telling you why it's oppressive, all sorts of things, right? We'll go a bit further and tell you, like, look, it stems from this idea that a woman's autonomy should always be limited, right? This is literally a visceral drawing of what a woman should and shouldn't behave like within society. It is flawed definitions of moderate dressing that is used to oppress women in various different circumstances. Note that most other things within society, i.e. for example, women not getting education, women not getting proper rights, not being allowed to drive and all sorts of things, are all stemmed from this one idea that women and their rights should be limited and their autonomy should be limited. And note that the hijab is the biggest and most visceral example of this idea taking place. Note that it is significantly harder to oppress women the point in time in which you don't have this form of visceral thing taking place. For example, in relatively more moderate Muslim countries like Indonesia and Turkey, women aren't forced to wear the hijab. Oppressing women in those particular areas is harder for those governments, even though like Turkey is like really becoming a police state if anything, it is still significantly harder for the Turkish government or the AK party to enact similar laws to oppress women, given that the hijab was never mandatory to begin with. But in states where it is significantly easier because they already have visceral reality of women and their autonomy being oppressed. The point in time in which you sustain the hijab, you sustain this idea that a woman's autonomy should be reduced in vast different contexts. So that means that your other external rights for women will almost never materialize the point in time in which you don't tackle the core of it, which is the hijab, which symbolizes a form of external oppression they weren't willing to deal with, right? It's where all oppression tends to stem from. But secondly, right, why is it that you must risk your life for this particular instance? Or why is it that you make this an obligation on most people, right? Look, it's the same reason most things would be an obligation upon many activists, right? Look, you have been personally oppressed, you want to take it upon yourself to bring change, or you as an individual have had people around you, family, friends, all sorts of people that were oppressed by the same regime, right? These are the situations where, these are the specific reasons as to why individuals can take it upon themselves to risk their lives. There are various different instances as to why individuals will put themselves in harm's way, but you should know that at the point in time in which you are an activist, you have an obligation to ensure that you have the greatest level of efficiency for that particular fight. And note that an uncompromising stance is never going to take place, or sorry, never going to materialize, never going to have any good positive thing materialize, or at least laws change, right? It is an uncompromising stance, as I'll prove to you, which would be the best way to do so. So given that an obligation exists on like social rights activists to ensure that the efficacy is prioritized, well, as long as we can prove that this is the most efficient way to do so, these individuals, like, we still win this issue as to why they should and shouldn't risk their life in this particular instance, right? But secondly, on why an uncompromising blanket stance is against the hijab is generally the best thing to do so. Before that, yeah. Not POI? Okay, yeah. Moving on. So why an uncompromising stance is generally the best thing here, right? So a few things that they told you. They said that, look, these individuals will be looked upon as social pariahs in their particular societies, and like nothing's going to change, right? I think there's various nuances that they are forgetting, right? The law that literally restricts your ability to do so many different things is extremely archaic in nature. So when you want to combat such a law, proportionality is going to be your best friend. Literally, compromising, organic change, all sorts of fluffy rubbish doesn't actually lead to anything useful. When you're talking about, say, a society like Saudi Arabia, it was literally when women hopped into a car and drove down the streets where any useful legislation against female drivers was materialized. Radical stances are necessary. We've seen the same thing happen with the Roads Must Fall movement in South Africa, where students literally stormed parliament and forced them to make better laws in the situations where they're studying, right? So these are the situations in which proportionality has to be met in order to make any form of significant change. But also note, I still don't understand what OO is trying to achieve at the end of this debate, right? Like, the situation that they want to have is something like basically status quo. I think that the point in time in which you stay that way, some women are still likely to be looked upon as social pariahs, as not everyone wants to comply with these things. It is those women that are the minority within those societies that we must prioritize and fight to make a better society. Yes?
Maybe it's true that having laws about the hijab make it easier to pass all sorts of oppressive laws, but your burden, if you want to show that this is an impact multiplier, is to show that when you get rid of the hijab laws, all of those things will fall as well. Otherwise, women will still have to fight for those things again and again. It'll be far easier on our side of the house.
Okay, yeah, no, like I've already told you, right? It's significantly harder at the point in time. Hijab legislations are not in many countries. Like, you don't have a visceral, like, you don't actually see a lot of these women being oppressed openly, right? We've told you how there's sort of a trend analysis to prove that many Muslim societies that don't have such legislations have a better way of escaping such archaic laws, or at least have a better progression towards women's rights as opposed to ones that don't. But secondly, right, on proportionality, note that in many circumstances, like, you literally have to meet these archaic laws with similar measures to ensure that they are actually changed. If you're talking about tangible change or bringing some form of a useful impact, like, unless you take measures that are of equal magnitude, you're never going to garner any form of successful change. So obviously the comparative in this debate is this, that one, we have far more useful ways of ensuring that you get at least some hope or semblance of hope to ensure that a future where women do not have, where women have better rights, especially in places like Iran. But more importantly, we've proven to you why on principle Iranian feminists should do so, as this law is literally the mother of all oppression that exists within these societies. You take this away, you make things better for the other parts. Thank you.
All right. Hijab in a Western context can be oppressive towards women because some women do not agree to being born in a religion that they do not consent to, being locked in a geographical area that prescribe them towards an Islamic theocracy, that women ultimately have to go through the expectation of them being subservient to men. But the strategy from opening and closing government ultimately harms the ability for feminist movement to be able to garner more rights for women, especially in the Muslim world, because ultimately it's linked towards them attacking the identity and the religious obligation of women. And that's how I'm going to extend structurally from closing, because Techway did take some of it in the opening. So, but before that, I will have 3 extraneous rebuttals before moving on to my unique extension. Firstly, the contention from opening government was that that most of the privileged women in Iran are complicit in the continuous oppression of women in general, because they seem to suggest that these women have access to political power. No, thank you. That these women have access to media, and therefore, with them being obligated to take this responsibility, that they somehow can change things for the better. Recognize that that they did not make this principle independent from the practical outcomes of this debate. Therefore, they need to justify how political change can happen in their world. But B, we would suggest that what could possibly happen is that it is less likely for the same movement, that it is more likely that the same movement that you're talking about will lose political power, because if they are still beholden to voters, they are more likely going to be male. If they are locked in constituencies whereby they are predominantly male, they will lose out political power, and therefore there is no reason for them to be elected in the future. Therefore, all your arguments about political change is less likely going to happen. But B, we think that the voter behavior that could possibly happen in Iran can drastically change that one that is more likely going to prioritize Islam even more, because now it is seen as an attack towards your Islamic identity and your Islamic obligation. Therefore, that means that maybe to some extent, because they are women, they are going to be oppressed a lot more with policies specifically catered to them that would oppress them, i.e. more male guardianships, restrictions on what jobs they can do, restrictions to what kind of education that they can get in universities, because they are not willing to to put themselves in a situation whereby women can rise up again. Therefore, that's the likely outcome that could exist. But the second thing they say is that, past protests do exist, and this can be used as a precedence in order for us to justify that structural change can happen. Note that uniquely that Islam is out of the picture when it comes to discussing about the economy, mismanagement of funds, and corruption. We think that in a world whereby Islamic feminists in Iran specifically target women, that telling them that they are oppressed because this is an obligation that they must not do anymore, changes the way that protests are generally going to work. Media is not going to be seeing it as one of empowerment. Media is more likely going to see it as one that attacks our fundamental core of being an Islamic theocracy. That's why we think generally it will be so much worse, and therefore they need to prove that structural change can happen, and they haven't proven that. But thirdly, dealing with closing government. They wanted to argue that this hijab law is seen as the barrier, as the gateway for future oppression that women have to go through, because they are seen as a rule to restrict female autonomy, and therefore as a result of this restriction, other restrictions can follow as a result of that. Recognize that we think that autonomy is restricted as a result of religion, but we think that fundamentally it is up to the interpretator of religion to believe in that interpretation. Maybe some women in Iran, being taught that Islam is ultimately linked towards their identity, would think that it is one of modesty. Maybe your liberal woman in Iran would think that this is one that attacks me as a woman because I'm unable to choose what I want. But the goal of the feminist movement must be one that takes ambiguity. At least we must offer women some ability to choose whether or not this is oppressive towards them. And I will explain later why this is likely going to harm the feminist movement a lot more. Before that, yes.
People opted to the feminist movement to help other women. Custodian laws are not as visible as the hijab. Why is this not a fight that is a priority if it is a personal choice that affects you?
But then again, let's look at it on a scale. Even if these women consent to being an activist, consent to undergoing all the harms you say is likely going to happen under the other side of the house, we will suggest, on a balance, it is very likely in a world where the Iranian government is more likely going to react negatively, more women are going to be harmed, and therefore we will prioritize the protection of more women that we can say happens under our side of the house. So firstly, let's understand the context and the scenario of how that Islamic theocracy exists, and why that feminism, if it's looked on a Western context, will be significantly degrading for women in Iran. Recognize that there are few unique circumstances that Iran goes through as a result of the West. The fact that they go through sanctions, the fact that they go through significant social engineering as a result of a coup, the fact that they have expressed dissatisfaction, ultimately using an Islamic revolution for them to get into power. Recognize that ultimately this protest stems from a Western outlook of what liberation and freedom is towards women. We think that extending from opening opposition, that once most women in Iran see this as a project that women in Iran are obligated to follow, what could happen is three things. That one, you are less likely going to get cooperation from the Iranian government, because the Iranian government will see this, no thank you, I've taken one from you already, that the Iranian government will see this as an attack towards their legitimacy as the sovereign leadership of Iran, because they do not seem to believe that Islamic theocracy is a form of government that is relatively good for Iranians. We think that generally most people are likely going to react negatively as a result of that. But B, we think that generally as a result of that, we think that the support for feminism in Iran will be diminished so much worse under that side of the house. Because people are less likely going to donate, because they know that the cost of donating means far more harm for themselves. Women are less likely going to go on protests as they suggested, because they go to significant self-harm. Women are less likely going to collectivize on social media, because as you say, that if the media is directly controlled by the state, they can still limit that access. We think that generally as a result of that, feminism will gain less traction in Iran, and as a result of that, we think that all the harms that they said is likely going to happen. But secondly, we think that it is also fundamentally seen as an attack of identity. We need to understand that most Iranians do still feel that Islam is primarily important. Be it things like the fact that it's in their constitution, and the fact that they are Islamic theocracy, the fact that their education system is based one of Islam. We think that generally most women in Iran do feel that Islam is still important to them. We think that if you alienate them, then is what is likely going to happen at that side of the house. I mean, less power for Iranian women be able to fight for cultural feminism, less ability for them to be politically empowered under the side of the house, less ability for them to be able to fight for political action that is necessary to empowering women in their world. We think that since they haven't proven the ability for Iranian women to uniquely benefit, that's why I'm so proud to oppose.
Thank you, Member Tom. Here.
I think to just say that some people feel attacked when they tell you to take off your hijab doesn't engage to the fact that there's a broader amount of individuals who feel attacked by having to be forced to wear the hijab in the first place. One form of attack doesn't delegitimize the other and doesn't mean the other shouldn't be a cause worth fighting for. So we think that just because some people are unhappy about it because it goes against religion, we firstly say that religion is oftentimes interpreted in the most patriarchal way which benefits men the most. And at the point in which they're able to control over what women wear, and like unfortunately some people actually do buy into that, just because you feel attacked doesn't mean all the other individuals who are forced into wearing hijab don't have a legitimate cause in protesting. I'll do a few things in my speech, but first let's engage with opening opposition, because I think a lot of contribution from closing opposition is derivative from that. But firstly, they told you that justification into not having an obligation is literally just because you need to save yourself. Ilsa told you that as a role of an activist, when you have the platform and you have the capability to gather individuals and gather in the masses, that's why you should use your platform to advocate for women's rights. But even more than that, I think the specific nuance here is, if you opt out, it's literally being selfish. It's literally being blinded and not being a part of the greater amount of individuals who are suffering. Have a seat. But even more than that, the fact that you actively know that other individuals are suffering but you turn a blind eye, that is a world where you have not done your job as an activist and you have literally brought down the stake that you have fought as a feminist cause. So we also think it directly contradicts the feminist cause, that at the point in which your autonomy and your ability to choose is taken away, that's when you have to fight for your principles, and that's why you have the obligation, because you stem out of the feminist cause of basic rights and of basic autonomy, that you should be fighting to at least be a part of your principle. But even more than that, they told you that it's not justified because feminism should always advocate for choice and not simply whether to wear or to not wear. First response would be, in Iran, literally everyone tells you to wear your hijab. There is literally no one there who will tell you you can take off your hijab. So what this means is, for a really huge rhetoric, the proportionality necessitates that you have an extra big rhetoric to fight it as well. Literally because amount of individuals who are obligated, not just obligated to think, but actually buy into the idea that women have to wear hijab, you need an extremely strong counter-narrative as well. Something Ilza told you, that radical stances is proportionate within these circumstances to make sure at the very least you provide the individuals who don't want to wear hijab a choice. That's the very basic minimum that we are trying to fight for. But even if we don't achieve, the very fact that you at least provoke discussion and provoke individuals to rethink about your interpretation, which directly delegitimizes a lot of women, those are discussions only we provide at the point in which you have radical stances. The comparative on opposition is literally status quo. Nothing happens. Organic change may or may not occur, but even if it occurs, it will occur in the next 100 or 200 years. The amount of individuals you sacrifice within that time span is so many, and we don't like it. So we think in conclusion that the strength of the counter rhetoric necessitates for you to make it radical and for you to make it something that people will talk about. Just going out protest while having your hijab won't make a difference. Have you seen? But furthermore, they told you that it's less significant, and we think education and other problems are more significant. Firstly, I'd say, who are you to tell them what's the significant problem? You don't understand the significance of personal experiences about wearing the hijab. Those are nuances in which we think only individuals in Iran can tell you about it. But even more than that, Ilza told you that a lot of the problems and a lot of policies in status quo stem out of the idea that hijab is something that you have to do. That because you are subservient to the male body, and because you are subservient towards other individuals within society, that's where you have to comply. But even more than that, have you seen? We don't think it delegitimizes any other form of fight, but we think it further helps. Because if you can at least have the basic autonomy and have the basic rights to your body, that's why other forms of right will be granted. Because if individuals don't trust you with your own body, what makes you think they're going to trust you with education or going to trust you with handling the economy? Those are things which directly stem from the basic idea on whether or not individuals have autonomy over their body or not. But even more than that, have you seen? We think this idea of feminism and Islam not being able to intersect, coming from opening opposition and closing opposition, is extremely untrue. The only reason why they're not intersecting is because you don't allow them to intersect. Because the interpretations within Iran, which are very patriarchal and very conservative, is the reason why they can't intersect. In our world, we prefer where you have counter rhetorics and you have different interpretations as well to make sure that intersect. At the very least, you have those individuals, those people who are non-hijabi and want to be Muslim, are able to have that intersection only on our side of the house. In a world where you subdue the status quo and you only listen to what they say, that's a world where feminism and Western values will never intersect. So we think that the only way for you to achieve that end is to have the counter rhetoric. Have you seen? I'll take you to what. But lastly, they told you that people will disassociate with the cause. I think firstly that more people would want to associate with the cause because finally there's some form of visibility of individuals fighting. But even more than that, the fact that we put you and as having an obligation means that a lot more people would naturally want to go out and fight with them. When you make them aware that you should be fighting, that you have a cause to fight, that's when they will start fighting. I'll take closing.
So if your benefits discourse, why would that discourse likely be good if you will concede that symmetry of information does exist and the Islamic theocracy do not need women to maintain political power?
So I think it's on a comparative. At the very least, we provide you that avenue for discourse. Maybe it won't be healthy now, but the progression in which individuals would take would more likely be progressive. Comparative on your side, you do nothing and get no discourse at all. Because literally, if only women just go out and protest, like what they do in status quo, nothing will materialize. But even more than that, what did Irza tell you, which is really important in this debate? He told you that the fact that it promotes better progression literally because it stems out of the idea that women have autonomy over their body and women have the ability to take control of their lives is something that takes away from hijab. At the point in which you can at the very least the basic minimum to care and to be able to choose what you wear, that's when you're able to at least give them some trust in doing other things. Because literally, if you can't be able to choose what you wear, what makes you think they're going to promote other forms of policies as well? So it's a comparative. Sure, maybe it won't lead there, but the very minimum and the very basic metric is already met on our side of the house. So this debate needs to exist literally in Iran, where individuals are persecuted and the strongest counter-rhetoric is for you to put on your hijab. Therefore, we need an equally strong and radical stance and take off their hijab.
Alright, thank you, Godfrey, for that speech. To end the debate, let's call for a good hearing.
Panel, we think in a world, in a country where it's an Islamic theocracy, where they prioritize religion more than above any other thing, the fact that they indoctrinate women, the fact that they have Islamic schools, the fact that they depend on the Ayatollah, these are things that they've been ignoring, right? Because they tell us that change can happen, that discourse will happen, all of the things that can gain garner benefits for women, of the feminist movement. But that completely relies on individuals in power for men to concede that women are actually equal than them, and we think that's unlikely for it to happen under their side. So I'll answer two questions in my speech. I'll answer are they able to galvanize enough support for the movement to create any form of change? Secondly, I'll deal with the principal claim that came from both opening and closing. So let's deal with change, because OG came up here and told us there is no incentive to protest. It's very minimal. It's unlikely for you. It's likely to die out. No, thank you. And they also tell us why. Because A, the media clamps down, and individuals are scared to go against the theocracy. I have a few problems with this. A, they don't tell us how exactly this changes under their side of the house. Why is it likely that media won't just clamp down harder on your protest? Why is it likely that right-wing politicians won't make stricter policies to restrict the freedom of expression of women? We have no idea how these structures change under both opening and closing. But secondly, the problem I have is that we say these structures become much more worse under your side of the house, because OG tells us, oh, there are existing policies to restrict women, so it's not mutually exclusive. They also tell us, they're not going to jail every Iranian woman. But firstly, we agree that's not what they're going to do. But what they can do and what they will do is A, harder media restrictions, censorship, make it harder for women to access media. B, make it harder for women to access public goods and education and welfare and better jobs. C, make it harder for you to get rid of all of that oppressive policies that you wanted to so get rid of. We think it's much harder for you. Then, no thank you. But then OG tells us, oh, we can get masses, we can garner enough support to enough political capital. A, it relies primarily on you getting the numbers that you need. But secondly, it relies on Iran being predominantly liberal, willing to trade off their religious beliefs for the feminist movement. The problem I have is this is firstly contradictory, right? Because first they say media will clamp down, policies will restrict protests, but then you say, oh, but we will get enough attention and media airtime. So which is it, right? Do you have media attention or do you not? Because it ignores the context that Fred exclusively provided to you. The psyche of individuals in Iran, the fact that there are strong anti-West sentiments because of the reasons like A, the West engineered the coup d'etat in Iran, the fact that the West countered created tensions with Iraq, the fact that West has huge amounts of sanctions upon Iran means that there's huge anti-West sentiments and hatred toward the West. This was the context uniquely provided by Fred that showed to you that there is strong, they are against strongly of the West. But secondly, the fact that there is Islamic theocracy, that means it's interwoven with their life. They're surrounded, they're forced to go to Islamic schools, they're surrounded by Islamic culture, and religion means a lot to the people. So what will happen then? Fred told you three things. The fact that Iranian government can see this as an attack on sovereignty and their theocracy. The fact that Fred told you the support will diminish because your moderate fence-sitters aren't going to support you anyway. Because A, they see this as a West movement, therefore they shouldn't subscribe to it. But B, they see this as an exclusive movement that excludes all of the women in Iran that find religion important to them. Lastly, it's an attack on their identity, because you alienate a lot of women in Iran who find their religious spirituality the most important part of their lives. Sure, they say, oh, there are liberal women. You have your liberal women, but you alienate all your moderate fence-sitters who still believe that wearing hijab is an important part of your life. You will never get them in the feminist movement because they will prioritize their spirituality. But lastly, no thank you. You know what? Sure, closing.
Restricting somebody's freedom to clothing and forcing them to wear one particular thing contradicts the core values of feminism. It has nothing to do with Western feminism in particular. Engage.
Restricting someone's choice to wear clothing is against feminism. You are restricting someone's choice to wear a clothing that they want because you force them to take off a hijab and take a picture of them and post it online. We think that's what happened under your side of the house. You are contradictory. But secondly, let's talk about CG, right? Because they tell us a lot of things. They tell us, oh, okay, we make it easier for women to intersect. Firstly, I don't know how, because you alienate a lot of women who feel like religion is important to them. That means maybe your moderate Christians will see that, oh, you alienate women who feel like religion is important to them, therefore I must not subscribe to this also. But no, thank you. Secondly, they talk about discourse, right? This is the weird part, right? Because they concede the discourse won't be healthy at first, but then it will be. My question is, when will it be healthy, right? Because we must understand that men control the media in status quo. Men control the political discourse, they control the political sphere, they're in positions of power, they are the CEOs, they are the richest men who have the most political capital. That means the discourse that will always surround the feminist movement is one that always vilify the feminist movement, one that always tells people that the feminist movement is radical and you must not subscribe to it. Or secondly, the discourse that happens will always we always tell Iranian people that you must not trust the feminist movement because it's because it's a Western movement that you must not trust. So lastly, the principal thing, I'll go through this briefly, right? Because their argument about obligation or responsibility is let's look on the balance of harm, right? Look, even if we concede that there are women who are forced to wear the hijab, let's look on the balance of harm. The worst case scenario is some women are forced to wear the hijab. The worst case scenario on the outside of the house is that the Iranian government will never trust the feminist movement, and the Iranian government will never give you the rights, give you the public goods that you want, your education, your welfare, your job. That's the worst case, and that's more women you harm on the outside of the house. On the balance of harm, I think their side harms more women and controls more women on the other side of the house.